The ferryman, a gaunt, silent man whose eyes seemed perpetually squinted against the salt spray, pointed a gnarled finger towards the receding coastline. "There it is," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper over the roar of the engines. Dean nodded, though he hadn't asked. He'd known it for the last hour, a jagged silhouette against the churning gray of the North Atlantic, a dark tooth jutting from the sea. Fog, thick and low, clung to the island's crags like a shroud, obscuring all but the immediate wave-battered rocks. It was precisely what he had sought. Isolation, an unforgiving expanse where the echoes of his past might finally dissipate into the wind. The small vessel bumped against the rickety wooden dock, sending a shiver through its rotten planks. Dean hefted his worn canvas bag, the strap digging into his shoulder, and stepped onto the splintered wood. He shivered, pulling his woolen jacket tighter. The ferryman, without a word, began to turn his boat, its engine sputtering back to life, leaving Dean utterly alone on the desolate landing. The path to the cottage was little more than a sheep track, winding upwards through gnarled, wind-stunted bushes and clumps of tough, salt-blasted grass. Dean felt the weight of his grief, a constant, dull ache in his chest, pressing down on him. But he also felt a strange, brittle sense of purpose. He was here to map this place, to chart its forgotten contours, to lose himself in the meticulous lines of a new geography. It was a desperate gambit, a cartographer's last resort against a world that had become unmappable. The lighthouse keeper's cottage appeared suddenly through a momentary thinning of the mist, a squat stone structure hunkered against the elements. A sense of profound neglect clung to it, a smell of abandonment and decay. He pushed open the heavy oak door. He fumbled for the light switch he knew from the estate agent's description, a heavy ceramic toggle by the door. With a flick, a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting a weak, jaundiced glow over the cramped living space. Dust motes danced in the anemic light. Furniture, shrouded in ancient dropcloths, loomed like pale ghosts. His grandfather, a man Dean had barely known, had left everything exactly as it was. A wave of melancholy washed over him, not just for his own loss, but for the silent, lonely life of the man who had lived here. He set about uncovering the furniture, pulling back the musty sheets. A small, rickety desk stood against one wall, beneath a grimy window that overlooked the turbulent sea. He ran a hand over its scuffed surface, feeling the grain of the aged wood. It was here, he decided, that he would set up his own charts, his new life. As he cleared the desk, his fingers brushed against a loose panel in the side. Curiosity, a familiar impulse from his years of detailed cartography, nudged him. He pressed against it, and with a faint click, a small, shallow drawer slid out. Inside, nestled amongst a few dried-out pens and a rusted compass, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and water-stained, the leather puckered in places as if it had been submerged. The binding was fragile, threatening to disintegrate in his hands. He opened it carefully. The script inside was his grandfather's, a spidery hand Dean recognized from the occasional birthday card he'd received as a child. The ink was faded, bleeding into the water-damaged paper in places, but the words were still legible. The entries were sporadic, obsessive. They spoke of the island, of the fog, of the depths. But then, the tone shifted. The later entries were frantic, almost desperate. Dean's eyes scanned a particular page, the ink blotted, the words barely clinging to the page. Not the wind, not the gulls. From beneath. It stirs, the pact. Forgotten, but not broken. The old ones knew. They built the remote monastery to ward it off. Foolish, futile. The remote monastery? He hadn't seen any such structure on his approach, only the cottage and the lighthouse. He flipped further, the pages growing stiffer, almost brittle. A crude map was sketched on the final page, a jagged outline of the island, but with strange, unnatural lines radiating from the depths, culminating in a small, ominous X marked somewhere inland, far from the lighthouse, near where the path seemed to vanish into the deeper fog. Next to the X, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a single word: waking. A sudden sharp rap echoed from the window pane. Dean flinched, dropping the journal. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the glass, an opaque, swirling gray. There was nothing there. Only the mist and the sound of the wind, now seeming to carry a faint, mournful hum that was not quite the sea. He told himself it was just the branches of the gnarled bushes rattling against the glass. It had to be, but the faint, cloying sweetness in the air seemed to intensify, and he felt, for the first time since he'd set foot on the island, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if something ancient and unseen had just taken notice of his arrival. The crude map scrawled on the brittle final page of the journal showed the jagged outline of the island, a familiar rendering of the lighthouse and the cottage. Then, starkly out of place, a small hand-drawn cross marked Remote Monastery. Dean traced the cross with a fingertip, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He hadn't seen any such structure on his approach, no ancient stone or weathered timber rising from the sparse landscape. He'd meticulously studied the navigational charts, noted every outcrop and feature. A monastery, remote or otherwise, would have been impossible to miss. He flipped back through the earlier pages, the paper stiff and cool beneath his touch, searching for context, but found none. He set the journal aside, its weight suddenly oppressive, and moved to the window. The fog had begun to thin, revealing a bruised purple horizon where the last vestiges of twilight bled into the encroaching night. He listened, trying to discern if the map was simply an old, fanciful detail, a relic from a time before accurate charts. But the inscription felt too deliberate, too recent in its faded ink. A low, sustained murmur, like a distant chorus of voices, seemed to ride the wind. Dean paused, head cocked, straining to hear. It wasn't the shriek of gulls or the groan of the wind through the eaves. This sound was deeper, more resonant, almost melodic, yet utterly devoid of warmth. He told himself it was the peculiar acoustics of the island, the way the fog and the cliffs could play tricks on the ear, twisting the natural sounds of the elements into something else entirely. He'd heard stranger things in his travels, he reminded himself, though he couldn't recall a specific instance. He decided to make a pot of coffee, the mundane task a welcome anchor against the growing strangeness. While the kettle whistled, he returned to the journal, compelled by a morbid curiosity. He picked it up again, the leather cover now feeling strangely clammy. He flipped past the map, deeper into the water-damaged pages he'd previously skimmed. Many were stuck together, requiring careful separation, revealing faded ink that bled into the paper, blurring words into illegible smudges. The air in the cottage, already thick with the scent of damp stone and brine, seemed to grow heavier, carrying a faint, fishy odor he hadn't noticed before. He found sketches, not of the island or the lighthouse, but of things that belonged to the deep. Tentacles, thick and rope-like, coiling around indistinct forms. Shapes that were vaguely humanoid, but with bulbous eyes and mouths that gaped in silent screams. One drawing depicted a creature with a skeletal fish-like head, its elongated fingers reaching towards a figure that could have been his grandfather, hunched and terrified. The lines were frantic, etched with a desperate energy that transcended mere artistic expression. His grandfather, a man he remembered as stoic and grounded, had drawn these nightmares. It calls, it waits. And then further down, almost illegible, a stark warning. Do not listen. Do not approach the monastery. The remote monastery again. A place his grandfather had warned against, a place Dean couldn't find. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss the drawings as the ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation. Perhaps the journal was a work of fiction, a bizarre hobby his grandfather had developed. The deep song could be a metaphor for the sea's relentless pull, the loneliness of a lighthouse keeper's life. He was a cartographer, a man of precise measurements and verifiable facts. He dealt in lines and coordinates, not in fantastical creatures and cryptic warnings. They seemed to swell and recede with the tide, a strange guttural cadence that pressed against the window panes. He felt a tremor underfoot, a low rumble that resonated through the stone foundations of the cottage. Not an earthquake, but something else. Something vast moving far below. The coffee machine sputtered, the rich aroma momentarily battling the encroaching dampness. He poured himself a mug, his hand not entirely steady. The tide, he realized with a jolt, was impossibly high. The usual high water mark was several feet below the cottage's foundation. But now, the waves surged almost to the edge of the rocky path, their foam licking at the very stones. It was too soon for the tide to be this high. It was wrong. He knew the rhythms of the sea, the predictable ebb and flow. This was not natural. He needed sleep, he told himself. The long journey, the grief, the isolation. It was all playing tricks on his mind. He was tired, disoriented. He would check the tide charts in the morning. He would dismiss the journal as the product of an overactive, aging imagination. The island was not as empty as he had believed. The unsettling image of the remote monastery, sketched in hurried, frantic lines, continued to haunt Dean. He had spent the morning retracing his steps, scrutinizing the island's sparse coastline through binoculars, walking the craggy paths, but the structure remained stubbornly absent. It was as if his grandfather had drawn a place that existed only in his mind. Or perhaps, a place now swallowed by the relentless sea or the creeping mists. Dean tried to rationalize it, to dismiss the drawings as the ramblings of an old man succumbing to isolation. Perhaps the journal was a work of fiction, a bizarre hobby his grandfather had developed to combat the crushing solitude. But a cold knot in his stomach refused to unravel. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor him against the rising tide of unease. The cottage, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its thick stone walls amplifying every creak of the old wood, every moan of the wind. With a grim resolve, Dean packed a small satchel, the worn leather of his grandfather's journal tucked securely inside. He would consult the island's records, whatever meager archives it possessed. The journey to the small coastal village was a blur of wind-whipped gorse and crashing waves. A stoic archivist, spectacles perched on his nose, regarded him with a wary gaze as he explained his purpose. My grandfather lived in the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Dean began, feeling the weight of his words. I'm trying to learn more about the island's history, perhaps anything specific to that area. The archivist nodded slowly, his eyes drifting towards a tall, metal-runged ladder leading to an upper shelf of ancient ledgers. There are some old tales, he said, his voice raspy, things the fishermen used to whisper. Before the war, before the mainland started sending folk out here for quiet. She retrieved a heavy, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle and yellowed. Not official history, mind you, more folklore. Dean settled at a heavy wooden table, the journal open before him. He skimmed through faded newspaper clippings detailing shipwreck accounts and census records, searching for any mention of the lighthouse or the elusive monastery. Then, tucked between two accounts of particularly brutal winter storms, he found it, a series of handwritten notes, transcribed from local oral traditions. They spoke of the deep dweller, an ancient entity said to slumber beneath the waves. They mentioned sacrifices and offerings made by the island's earliest inhabitants to appease it, ensuring bountiful harvests and safe passage. A pact that, the notes hinted, had been renewed periodically by a reclusive order once based in a hidden temple overlooking the Western Sound. Dean felt a jolt. The western sound was where he'd been searching for the monastery. His grandfather's frantic scrawls suddenly snapped into terrifying focus. The crude drawings of swirling tentacles and gaping maws weren't just the product of a fevered mind. They were echoes of these very legends. The pact his grandfather had hinted at in his journal, the one he claimed was weakening, now resonated with a horrifying clarity. "They promised to keep it asleep," his grandfather had written in a shaky hand. "But the bargain is broken. The deep remembers." Back in the cottage, the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple, then a moonless black. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the window panes. Dean, exhausted but wired, finally collapsed into bed, the journal's revelations and the village legends swirling in his mind. There were sounds, not voices, but a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through his very core. A sound like 1,000 whales singing a mournful, ancient dirge. Shapes writhed in the periphery of his vision, vast and indistinct, their movement slow, deliberate, as if navigating a world without friction. He saw glimmers of bioluminescent light, not like the soft glow of plankton, but a harsh, internal luminescence, pulsing with a malevolent rhythm. It was not a place of solace, but a gateway. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A patch of strange, iridescent algae had bloomed on the floorboards, just inches from where his feet had rested. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence, like a patch of captured starlight. The texture was gelatinous, almost spongy. It was impossible. The cottage was dry, sealed against the elements. Yet, here it was, a living, breathing testament to the impossible, an uninvited guest from the very depths his grandfather had warned against. It was unraveling, and whatever ancient thing it had bound was now finding its way in. Dean woke with a gasp, his body coiled tight, a phantom pressure still clinging to his chest. The dream, a fragmented nightmare of colossal, featureless forms writhing in an abyssal dark, had vanished the moment his eyes snapped open, leaving only a profound, cold dread. The cottage was steeped in a silence that felt heavier than usual, broken only by the persistent shriek of the wind outside, a sound that now seemed to carry an almost human quality, a low, guttural lament. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The memory of the journal, his grandfather's desperate scrawls, and the unsettling village legends pressed in on him. He needed coffee, a jolt of mundane reality to anchor himself. As he walked toward the small kitchen, a faint, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. Dean paused, listening intently. It was there, then gone, then subtly back, a deep, hypnotic pulse that seemed to originate from somewhere far below, yet resonated within his own skull. He dismissed it as an inner ear phenomenon, a trick of exhaustion. He reached for the kettle, his fingers brushing against a small ceramic mug that had been sitting squarely on the counter. It wasn't where he'd left it. He distinctly remembered placing it on the draining board after cleaning it last night. Now it sat on the edge of the counter, perilously close to the floor. A prickle of unease snaked up his spine. He picked it up, his brow furrowed, and placed it firmly back on the draining board. He was tired, that was all. Overthinking. The hum intensified slightly as the kettle began to boil, mingling with the rising steam. It was an unsettling counterpoint to the domestic sound, a subterranean throb that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. For a fraction of a second, his face wasn't his own. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his own haggard, familiar features. His breath hitched. He stared, unmoving, at the glass, but saw nothing but the gray, fog-choked morning beyond. His hands began to tremble. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't imagination. Something was happening. The hum was constant now, a low, insistent bass note that burrowed into his bones. Driven by a sudden, desperate need for answers, Dean moved through the cottage, his gaze sharpened. He found it in the small study, tucked away in a corner, covered by a moth-eaten canvas. The lock was old, rusted, but with a stout pry bar from the shed, he managed to force it open with a groan of metal. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed papers and brittle maps, was a collection of items that sent a fresh wave of ice through him. Small, crudely carved effigies of what looked like fish, but with too many eyes, too many teeth. He recognized one of the symbols from the journal, a looping, serpentine design that his grandfather had drawn repeatedly, always with an accompanying note about the deep. Beneath the crucifix, a small, leather-bound book, distinct from the journal, lay open to a page filled with sketches. They depicted a desolate, windswept structure, its stone walls weathered by centuries of salt and wind. Below the sketch, a single, precise inscription, the remote monastery, a bastion against the encroaching tide. His grandfather had sought help then. Someone had tried to understand. Someone had tried to fight. The stone crucifix, Dean realized with a jolt, must have come from there. It was a ward, a relic of protection, perhaps even a tool for sacrifice. The air in the study grew thick, laden with the scent of stagnant water and something metallic, like old blood. The hum pulsed, a living thing now, pressing in on all sides. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't opaque. It seemed to shimmer, to absorb the dim light, its edges constantly in flux, like water swirling in a confined space. It had no discernible features, no limbs, no head, yet its presence was overwhelming, a focused point of malevolence. It pulsed in time with the hum, a silent, predatory rhythm. Dean froze, every muscle screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move. His gaze was locked, half seeing, half imagining, at the aqueous form. A deep, guttural sound, like stones grinding under immense pressure, echoed in his mind, not heard through his ears, but felt directly in his skull. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. The hum, however, remained, now louder, more insistent, a siren song from the depths, calling him. Dean stumbled back, his legs weak, collapsing into the old armchair. He stared at the empty corner, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless hypnotic thrum. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was here. It had seen him. And it was waiting. The wind howled outside, a mournful lament that seemed to coil around the cottage's stone walls, finding every crack and crevice. He dismissed it as the weather, a trick of the acoustics, but the hum persisted, a deep, almost subaudible thrumming beneath the roar of the waves. His grandfather's hand had become less steady in these later passages, the ink slightly smudged in places, betraying an agitation Dean hadn't noticed before. The entry spoke not of casual visits to the remote monastery, but of a specific recurring pilgrimage. They detailed preparations, offerings, and the maintenance of the quiescent state. Dean's brow furrowed. Maintenance? His grandfather wasn't just observing, he was doing. One entry, dated years before his grandfather's disappearance, stood out. The deep song grows stronger with each tide. The basalt altar must be reinforced. The pact demands vigilance, or the slumbering leviathan will stir, and all will be undone. His grandfather hadn't merely visited the remote monastery. He had been involved in rituals there. Rituals to keep something dormant, something called the slumbering leviathan. And the deep song, that low, insistent hum he was hearing, was it? The hum intensified, no longer just the wind, but a pressure behind his eardrums, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It felt like a note struck deep within the earth, or perhaps within the ocean itself, reverberating through the bedrock of the island. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to push the sound away, but it clung to him, a pervasive, invasive melody. His focus wavered. The words on the page seemed to swim, the ink blurring into indistinct patterns. Was it fatigue? The relentless hum? He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then reopened them, forcing himself to concentrate. He needed to understand. Further entries revealed a terrifying truth. His grandfather wasn't just a guardian, but a participant in a long-standing desperate effort. The rituals, the pacts, the deep song. They were all part of an ancient struggle to keep the entity from fully awakening. Blood of the island? What did that even mean? He heard them at the edge of his perception, like voices speaking just outside an open window, just beyond his comprehension. He shook his head, trying to clear it. Hallucinations. Sleep deprivation. That was all it was. The journal entry about the lighthouse being the true anchor resonated with terrifying clarity. If the monastery held the knowledge, the lighthouse held the power, or perhaps the containment. He had to go to the lighthouse. It looked like a sequence, almost like a combination or a set of instructions. He grabbed a lantern, its glass rattling faintly in his grasp, and stepped out into the night. The fog had thickened, swallowing the cottage whole, turning the familiar path into a spectral corridor. The deep song here was overwhelming, not just a hum, but a living, breathing entity of sound that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet, from the crushing weight of the ocean surrounding the island. He stumbled, his boots finding purchase on the slick, seaweed-covered rocks. Each flash illuminated the swirling tendrils of fog, making them seem to writhe like phantom limbs. Reaching the lighthouse's base, Dean fumbled with the heavy, salt-encrusted door. He remembered the journal's crude drawing, focusing on the floor of the ground level. He ran his hands along the cold stone walls, searching for any anomaly, any hidden seam. He clutched his head, fighting the onslaught, the world spinning around him. "Focus, Dean, focus!" Then he saw it. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline. It wasn't a natural fissure. He pushed, pulled, searched for a latch. Finally, near the edge of the crack, he found a small, almost imperceptible indentation. He pressed it, and with a low, grinding groan that seemed to echo the deep song, a section of the stone floor began to slide inward, revealing a gaping black maw beneath. A set of rough-hewn stone steps descended into the black. This wasn't a basement. This was a crypt. A hidden chamber, deep beneath the lighthouse. A secret anchor to the island's horrifying truth. The deep song pulsed, urging him forward, promising answers, promising oblivion. The latch. It was small, almost flush with the flagstone, cleverly hidden beneath a layer of grime that Dean had initially dismissed as mere discoloration. His finger hooked into a tiny groove, barely perceptible. He pulled. A faint click, startlingly loud in the quiet chamber, echoed off the glass walls. With a groan that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the lighthouse, the circular section of flagstone began to sink, then pivot inward, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. A gust of air, cold and smelling of damp earth and something else, something ancient and utterly unbreathing, pushed past him. Dean recoiled, a shiver raking through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just a cellar. He fumbled for his lantern, its beam cutting a shaky path into the black. Stone steps, worn smooth by countless descents, spiraled down into the gloom. He could feel the weight of the island above him, the crushing pressure of the earth and rock. This wasn't just under the lighthouse. It felt under everything. The passage was long, a winding tunnel that seemed to defy the logical dimensions of the island itself. Dean's hand scraped against rough-hewn rock, cool and gritty. The smell intensified, a mineral tang mixed with something putrid, like stagnant seawater and forgotten decay. He wanted to turn back, But a morbid curiosity, a compulsion he couldn't name, tugged him forward. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. Before him stood not a cave, but an edifice of impossible age, carved directly from the living rock. This was the remote monastery. Its architecture defied any known style. Arches soared to unseen heights, supported by columns that seemed to twist and writhe like petrified leviathans. This place was not meant for human eyes. He moved through the echoing halls, his footsteps unnervingly loud. The air was still, heavy, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. He saw altars, crude and blocky, smeared with what looked like ancient, dried viscera. Then he saw it. At the center of the dais, where a crucifix or an idol might typically stand, was a rift. It wasn't a physical object, but a shimmering distortion in the very fabric of the air, a tear in reality itself. From its heart, a low, resonant thrum emanated, vibrating through the stone floor, up Dean's legs, and into his bones. He approached, drawn by an irresistible, horrifying fascination. He could feel a pressure building behind his eyes, a dull ache that threatened to split his skull. As he drew closer, the images carved into the monastery walls seemed to writhe, their eyes following him. It wasn't empty. He heard a sound, not with his ears, but directly in his mind, a vast, echoing call that was both a lament and a command, a promise of oblivion and an invitation to unspeakable power. Then the vision struck. It wasn't a memory, nor a dream. It was an intrusion, brutal and absolute. The remote monastery dissolved around him, replaced by a swirling vortex of crushing black water. He was submerged, unable to breathe, yet not drowning. The island, his lighthouse, the entire world above was gone, swallowed by a ravenous, unfathomable deep. He saw the entity. It was ancient beyond reckoning, older than light, older than the stars. It was not evil in the human sense, but an indifferent, consuming force, a primal hunger that sought only to reclaim what it considered its own. And the island, this remote, fog-shrouded rock, was merely a threshold. The vision intensified. He saw the island itself, cracking, groaning, sinking into the depths, pulled down by an unseen, titanic force. And then, the final horrifying insight. The entity wanted him. Not his body, not his life, but his mind, his consciousness, to be absorbed, assimilated, to become another facet of its own boundless, horrifying awareness. He was not a sacrifice. He was merely a vessel to be emptied, then filled with its own alien thoughts. The thrumming intensified, a chorus of silent voices screaming in his skull. He was trapped. The secret was out. And the entity, whatever ancient horror it was, knew he was there. It was awake, and it was coming for him. The island was its domain, and he, a mere trespasser, was now marked. There was no escape. Only the crushing weight of the deep waiting to claim him. The latch clicked, a sound sharp and brittle, echoing off the thick panes of glass that walled the observation room. Beneath it, not a passage, but a void. A narrow shaft, barely wide enough for his arm, plunged into absolute blackness. He knelt, peering into the opening. No light penetrated the gloom. He imagined it dropping straight down, an unplumbed well into the island's heart. A strange pressure began to build in his ears, a low thrum that vibrated through the flagstones, through his knees, up into his chest. It wasn't a sound heard with his ears, but felt in his bones, a subsonic hum that spoke of immense, churning depths. It clawed at his skin, seeped into his clothes, and settled deep in his marrow. His breath plumed white. Panic, raw and visceral, seized him. This wasn't just a presence. It was an active, malevolent force, reaching for him, trying to draw him in, to claim him. He scrambled backward, his hands slapping against the cold stone floor. The flagstone panel, still open, seemed to gape like a hungry maw. With a desperate surge of strength, Dean slammed it shut. The click echoed again, but this time it was a sound of finality, of a barrier re-established, however fragile. His hands shook so violently he could barely grip the tattered leather journal he still clutched. Trapped. He was utterly trapped. The storm outside raged, sealing him in, while whatever lurked beneath the island pressed in from all sides. This was it, the final desperate play. Dean flung himself onto the wooden desk, scattering loose charts and pencils. He tore through the journal's brittle pages, his fingers clumsy, almost tearing the delicate paper. Cryptic symbols, faded sketches of constellations, distorted sea creatures, and arcane script blurred before his eyes. He wasn't looking for understanding, but for a sign, a keyword, anything that might offer a reprieve from the encroaching madness. His gaze darted, frantic, over pages describing ancient pacts and forgotten lore. He squinted, trying to decipher the faded ink. He read on, his eyes devouring the words. The ritual was incomplete, fragmented. It spoke of a confluence of energies, of specific astronomical alignments, and a location. Must be performed within the hallowed grounds, where the ancient stones hold the earth's memory. At the remote monastery, where the veil thins. The remote monastery. The island had one, a crumbling ruin on the northernmost bluff, long abandoned. He'd seen it on his maps, a forgotten landmark. The passage was ambiguous, veiled in metaphor. The intent was horrifyingly clear. A forfeiture of the self, a severing of the tie that binds the spirit to the waking world, a sacrifice not of blood, of essence, that which holds one rooted to the light, to peace, to the memory of joy. Dean froze. A forfeiture of the self. What did that mean? His ability to grieve? His capacity for happiness? His very identity, the core of who he was? To give up the memory of joy, to surrender the possibility of ever healing from his tragedy, to exist as an empty vessel, forever haunted by the shadow of what he'd lost. He looked from the terrifying words in the journal to the hidden latch, then out at the storm-lashed sea, a churning, hungry expanse. The rain hammered against the glass, a relentless drumbeat against the fragile barrier of the lighthouse. It wanted in. It wanted him. He had found his answer, but the price was himself. Dean closed his eyes, the image of the unblinking eye burning behind his lids. He just didn't know if he could survive it. The island was screaming, not with sound, but with an agonizing distortion of form and substance that clawed at Dean's perceptions. The air, thick and metallic, pressed in, heavy as wet wool, carrying the stench of brine and something else, a cloying, sweet decay that hinted at things not meant to rot on land. From the small, grimy window of his cottage, he watched the sea churn, not in the rhythmic heave of natural waves, but in a chaotic, frothing violence that seemed to defy gravity. Waves rose like obsidian cliffs, hung suspended for an impossible moment, then crashed down with the force of a tectonic shift, sending spray high enough to lick at the lighthouse's lamp. The fog, a constant companion, had intensified, becoming a living thing. It writhed, snaked, and coalesced into shifting forms that pressed against the glass, momentarily suggesting grotesque faces or impossible limbs before dissipating into featureless vapor. Through its pall, Dean glimpsed the shoreline. The kelp beds, usually a dark tapestry clinging to the rocks, had swelled, their fronds thick and bulbous, pulsating with an inner, sickly luminescence. Barnacles on the exposed rocks had grown to the size of fists, their shells mottled with iridescent green and black, slowly opening and closing as if breathing the toxic air. He saw a dead seabird, washed ashore, its feathers matted, but its eyes were not the dull glass of death. They were wide, black, and seemed to follow his gaze. This was it, then. The entity's encroaching dominion, a physical manifestation of the psychic pressure it exerted. It wanted to remake the world in its image, starting with this isolated rock. Dean felt it too, a constant thrum beneath his skin, a siren song of oblivion that promised peace if he would only let go. But letting go, he now understood, meant far more than simply giving up his life. A forfeiture of the self, a severing of the tie to the waking world. He had wrestled with those words, turning them over and over in his mind since reading them in his grandfather's journal. Now, in the face of this escalating horror, the meaning had solidified with a horrifying clarity. It wasn't just his life, or his sanity, or even his identity. It was his grief. His profound, consuming grief for his lost loved one. That grief, agonizing as it was the last enduring tether to the memory, to the love, to the very essence of what had been. To forfeit the self meant to sever that tie, to surrender the memory of joy, to relinquish the possibility of ever healing. It meant becoming an empty vessel, a hollow echo, devoid of the very thing that made him human, the very thing that connected him to the world he fought to save. This was the ultimate cost, to become nothing so that others might remain something. He thumbed past the frantic entries detailing the entity's awakening, past the desperate pleas for understanding, to the final, almost illegible scrawl. His grandfather, in his final desperate moments, had outlined the counter-ritual. It was a ritual of binding, of containment, not of destruction. The entity was ancient, primordial, beyond obliteration. And the key, the fulcrum, was the forfeiture. The instructions were stark, simple, yet pregnant with terrible implications. A specific sequence of symbols, drawn with a pigment derived from rare deep-sea algae. And a focal point, a place where the veil between worlds was thinnest, where ancient power could be channeled. The remote monastery. He had already packed a small satchel, anticipating this. The ground floor of the cottage was too vulnerable, too exposed to the entity's growing influence. The monastery, built centuries ago by monks who understood the island's peculiar energies, offered a chance. He wouldn't need it for long. The path to the monastery was treacherous, especially now, with the ground itself seeming to ripple and shift. But there was no turning back. The decision had been made, the cost understood. He stepped out of the cottage, the wind immediately tearing at him, a physical blow. The air tasted of ozone and salt and something else, something fetid and alive. The gulls, usually a cacophony, were silent, replaced by a low, mournful groan that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. He gripped the satchel, the journal inside feeling like a lead weight. Every step was an act of will against the burgeoning chaos. The path was slick with an unnatural slime, the sparse vegetation along its edges already twisted into grotesque parodies of life vines like grasping tentacles, leaves like gaping mouths. The journey to the remote monastery was a gauntlet. He stumbled over unseen roots, his boots sinking into the softened earth. He knew the entity was aware of his intent, that it was fighting back, trying to break his will before he could reach his destination. But Dean pressed on, his gaze fixed on the faint, almost swallowed silhouette of the ancient stone structure ahead. He could see it now, a hulking, defiant presence against the storm-ravaged sky. Its bell tower a broken finger pointing accusingly at the churning heavens. The walls, weathered by centuries of salt and wind, seemed to hum with a dormant power, a quiet strength that offered a sliver of hope in the heart of the maelstrom. This was where it would end, one way or another. He stood in the pulsing heart of the lighthouse, the great lamp above him casting an erratic, sickly yellow beam through the churning fog. The air, thick and metallic as congealed blood, pressed in, heavy as wet wool, carrying the stench of brine and something else. a cloying, sweet decay that now felt less like a hint and more like a breath on his neck. He clutched the weathered, salt-crusted leather-bound journal he'd retrieved from the remote monastery, its pages brittle with age, its ink faded but still legible in the lamp's unsteady glow. The ritual. The instructions were maddeningly cryptic, filled with archaic symbols and warnings, but he had pieced together enough. The floor beneath his boots was no longer solid. It seemed to undulate, a slow, sickening swell that mirrored the abyssal churning outside. The lighthouse groaned, a deep, resonant sound that was more organic than structural, as if the stone itself were screaming with the island. His hands shook, not from weakness, but from the raw, psychic static that vibrated through the very air. It promised solace, an end to the ache. If only he would cease. If only he would surrender. Dean squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, the image of his loved one's face flickering behind his eyelids, twisted into a silent plea. No. He wouldn't give in. Not now. The obsidian shard scraped against the stone floor as he attempted to draw the first symbol, a complex sigil of binding and warding described in the monastery's texts. The stone resisted, as if the very fabric of the lighthouse was fighting his intent. It was a pressure on his skull, a deep-sea thrum that vibrated through his chest. He felt his mind begin to unravel, his perceptions fraying at the edges. He pressed on, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He placed the calcified coral at the center of the sigil, then the amulet. The journal lay open, its pages now appearing to ripple, the ancient script blurring and reforming into indecipherable patterns. A phantom touch, yet utterly real in its invasive horror. He stumbled, nearly falling, his knee scraping against the rough floor. He remembered the final crucial step from the monastery's forbidden texts, the sacrifice. Not of blood, not of life, but of connection. A severing. A profound personal immolation of self. A deliberate descent into the very isolation he had sought, but now with no hope of return. The entity was not merely to be sealed. It was to be fed, a part of the one who dared to bind it, a piece of their reality, their sanity, their very essence, to ensure its slumber. This was the reveal, the horrifying truth veiled in the ancient ritual. The lighthouse was not just a beacon, it was a sacrifice point, a conduit. And he, Dean, was to be the offering. He looked out through the lamproom's glass, the world outside a maelstrom of black water and blinding fog. The sea was no longer just water. It was a hungry maw, vast and ancient. He saw, or imagined he saw, impossible shapes churning beneath the surface, titanic forms that defied geometry, that should not exist. They were reaching. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the metallic, decaying air. He placed his palm flat against the calcified coral, pressing down until the sharp edges bit into his skin. As the words left his lips, a searing pain lanced through his hand, spreading up his arm, not physical, but a profound, excruciating severing. He felt his memories, his sense of self, his connection to the world, begin to fray, to dissolve into a vast, echoing emptiness. The entity recoiled, not in defeat, but in satiation, its overwhelming presence momentarily lessening, pulling back like a tide. The island's scream began to diminish, slowly, agonizingly, until it was merely a low, grinding hum. The lighthouse shuddered violently, then settled. He had sealed it. He had paid the price. The air, thick and metallic as congealed blood, pressed against his lungs. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that the light was more than a navigational aid. It was a ward, a tether, the grandfather's final, desperate attempt to bind the encroaching blackness. Dean looked up at the enormous lens, then down at the worn, salt-encrusted machinery, his gaze falling on the tarnished brass plate near the base. It bore a single etched symbol, a spiraling vortex that mirrored the patterns he'd seen in the old charts, the ones that had hinted at the island's true purpose. Determination, cold and sharp, cut through the terror. He wouldn't just observe. He would act. His hands, trembling but resolute, reached for the main lever, a massive, rusted handle that controlled the lamp's output. This wasn't about turning it off, or even just turning it on. It was about tuning it, forcing its beam into a frequency that would counter the invasive rhythm of the deep song. He pushed the lever, gritting his teeth against the rising crescendo of the island's lament. The lamp's hum deepened, a low thrum that fought against the external shriek. Dean felt a searing heat bloom in his chest, a direct channel between his own will and the lighthouse's ancient power. The light intensified, no longer sickly yellow, but a blinding, pure white that seemed to tear at the fabric of the fog. The vortex symbol on the brass plate began to glow, a faint, pulsing blue, drawing strength from him, from the island itself. The shriek reached an unbearable pitch, then fractured. The metallic taste in the air lessened, replaced by the sharp tang of ozone and brine. Dean slumped against the cold metal casing of the lamp, gasping, his vision blurring. He had done something. He didn't know what exactly, but the immediate threat had receded. He must have wandered from the lighthouse in a daze, the details of his journey a jumbled haze of wet rock, wind-whipped grass, and the taste of salt on his cracked lips. He remembered the faint scent of wood smoke and old incense, a stark contrast to the ocean's wild breath. He remembered a hand, gentle but firm, guiding him. He awoke to the muted glow of a single oil lamp, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and dried herbs. He lay on a narrow cot in a small, austere room. Stone walls, ancient and damp, surrounded him. He sat up slowly, his muscles aching, his head throbbing. The elder, with eyes like polished obsidian, looked up as Dean stirred. "You have returned," the elder said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of surprise. "Or perhaps you have arrived." Dean tried to speak, but his throat was dry, raspy. "What? What happened?" The elder closed the tome with a soft thud. "You held back the tide. For now." He rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked to a small, rough-hewn table, pouring water from a clay jug into a wooden cup. "Drink. You are changed." Dean took the cup, his hands still trembling slightly, and drank deeply. "You have reinforced the ancient binding. A temporary measure, but a powerful one." He gestured around the small room. "This monastery, our order, we have guarded the knowledge for generations. Your grandfather was one of us, in spirit if not in vow. He maintained the light, the ward, as best he could." "What pact?" "The agreement forged between the island's earliest inhabitants and that which dwells below," the elder explained, his voice flat, factual. "A bargain for peace, for passage. It required a guardian, a conduit to maintain the balance. Your grandfather's duty, now yours." Dean stared, his mind reeling. His duty? He was a cartographer, a recluse, not a guardian of ancient horrors. "But I just amplified the light. I didn't make any pact." "You poured yourself into the light," the elder corrected. "You became the conduit. You are now attuned to the deep song, to its ebb and flow. You feel its stirrings, even in stillness." The elder's gaze seemed to pierce him. "The cost, Dean, is that you are now inextricably bound to this island, to its fate." He tried to dismiss it, to deny the elder's words, but a faint, rhythmic thrumming echoed in his ears. A sound beneath the sound of his own pulse. A distant, ceaseless hum that had been absent before, but was now undeniably there. He felt a faint, insistent tug, a yearning, not his own, but a deep, oceanic pull that resonated within his very bones. He looked down at his hands, seeing not just his skin, but a faint, almost translucent quality to them, as if the light had purged something and replaced it with a pale, deep-sea luminescence. He had sought solitude, a fresh start. He had found a prison, a burden, a transformation he hadn't asked for. The deep song was quieted, but it sang within him now, a perpetual silent melody that promised an unsettling eternal vigilance. His sanity wasn't shattered, not exactly. It was merely. He was the lighthouse, and the light was him. And the island, always, would be listening.